Hi, my name is Lawrence Smith. I'm a professor of environmental studies and of Earth, Environmental, and Planetary Sciences at Brown University. And I'm happy to join you today in celebration of the 2020 Earth Day. Um, like everybody, I'm locked down at home due to the coronavirus pandemic. Therefore, the picture you see behind me is clearly just a picture. Um, First, because of the pandemic, and second, the second way you know it's just a picture and I'm not really in the Canadian Northwest Territories right now is because I could never wear just a t-shirt. I would be swarming with mosquitoes. That said, this remote lake and the millions of others like it in the Canadian Shield are very interesting scientifically. They are real hotspots of ecological life, as well as significant sources, natural sources of the greenhouse gases of methane and CO2 to the atmosphere. And they have received surprisingly little study up until now because of their remoteness. However, over the past 5 years, new remote sensing technologies and programs have begun studying northern lakes and rivers and wetlands like these in detail. And what I thought I would do today is to talk about some of these new technologies and programs, including NASA's Arctic-Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, which is conducting ongoing airborne and field campaigns all across Western Canada and into Alaska, as well as new constellations of exciting CubeSats. These are tiny satellites, not much bigger than a bread box, that have been launched by the aerospace company Planet, which are transforming remote sensing of dynamic northern surface water, as well as two very important new conventional space satellite missions, the Icesat-2 laser altimeter and the forthcoming surface water and ocean topography radar satellite. Its short name is SWAT. All of these portend some exciting new opportunities for remote sensing of dynamic northern surface water. So what I thought I would do today is to just take you through a short slideshow to illustrate some of these ideas. So let me switch here. There we are. I hope everyone can see that. So this research is funded by NASA and is really the sort of a summary overview of the compilation of work by many of my graduate students and international collaborators, especially in Canada, but especially the work of my graduate students, Sarah Cooley and Ethan Kizabat at Brown University, and Jessica Fain at UCLA, which is my former institution until last summer. And so this little overview here will include a lot of their amazing work. Even though I'm the one presenting it, much of the core work is being led by my students. So just as a sort of review of the motivations for this kind of work, these northern Arctic boreal regions contain the world's highest abundance of surface water. These are lakes and rivers and wetlands, making them very important to the ecology of the region, carbon cycles, water cycles, greenhouse gas emissions, and human use. This is a populated part of the world. And it's obviously very remote, very difficult to access in the field, very expensive to access. You know, there are no roads in the summertime to speak of. You have to use helicopters and float planes and so forth. And so therefore, remote sensing studies or surface water studies in this part of the world have traditionally used satellite remote sensing to map inundation extent. These are sensors from Landsat, Aster, MODIS, Sentinel-2. These are the acronyms of these very well-known satellite missions. However, the spatial resolution of these technologies tends to be quite coarse, and the pardon, those are my small kids screaming in the background. Never mind them. They tend to be quite coarse, and as a result, the smallest water bodies tend to be very poorly mapped. And this is important because the smallest water bodies are, first of all, more abundant than the big ones, and they're also very seasonal. They come and go, which makes them ecologically important. And they also tend to be big emitters of greenhouse gas. And so this, and furthermore, the fine scale studies of these processes and finer scales have been hampered not only by the lack of high resolution imagery, but also the virtually complete lack of water level information, i.e. the vertical height of the water level. So, but these new technologies are coming to the rescue, and that is what I'd like to talk about today. The foremost program I would like to alert you to is something called the NASA Arctic-Boreal Vulnerability Experiment, or ABOVE. This is a decade-long program that is using airplanes and field crews and weather stations and all of this integrated with satellite measurements to really understand the ecology, the hydrology, and social issues over this remote part of the world. It's a very sweeping program. I'm involved with it in a fairly focused way with regards to surface water hydrology, but it's actually a very ambitious program with a lot of funding and a lot of data sets and a lot of flight campaigns. In fact, there was supposed to be a whole bunch of more flight campaigns this summer in 2020, but of course they've been canceled due to the COVID-19 crisis. But I fully expect them to pick up again next year. There's a nice overview paper, recent one in the journal Environmental Research Letters that has been published describing what's going on there. They also have a great website that is kept current and up to date. So I bring this exciting program to your attention. I have been involved with the NASA ABOVE program as a flight PI. That's the name given to an investigator who leads an airborne flight campaign over the study domain. And the airborne sensor that I led for this purpose was called AirSwat. AirSwat is a radical new radar technology that is specifically designed to map in 3 dimensions water surface elevations over lakes, rivers, and wetlands. And the radar is what's called Ka band. That's this middle, here's an image of it here in the middle of this slide, presented in color tones. The novel measurement that it makes is to map water levels with dense spatial coverage. Also, accompanying the radar on AirSwat is a color infrared mapping camera. There's an example of it here on the left. It's very traditional old school technology, but critical for interpreting and understanding the new radar data. These other acronyms refer to other airborne sensors that have been flown over this area in Western Canada and Alaska. The other technology I'm going to briefly talk about today is called ELVIS, which is a laser topographic scanner that very carefully maps topographic height of water surfaces and vegetation and land. These other ones across the bottom, I'm not going to have time to get into today, but they just point to the broad array of technologies that are being deployed in Northern North America through the NASA ABOVE program. Let's look a little closer at the AirSwat flights, which I directed in the year 2017. It was an incredibly extensive flight campaign that took place over the summer. Tens of thousands of kilometers were covered by this aircraft, beginning in southern Canada and Saskatoon and flying north up through Edmonton and Yellowknife. You can sort of trace the progress of the flight campaign here through these yellow lines on the left, up through Yellowknife, all the way up to Inuvik in Arctic Canada, then crossing the border into Alaska, where we staged the aircraft out at Fairbanks, then flew from Fairbanks to map the Yukon Flats, very extensive area of wetlands along the Yukon River in north central Alaska, as well as the north slope of Alaska as well. And the payload on the plane consisted of the AirSwat radar, the Ka band interferometric radar that I mentioned before, a bunch of antennas deployed on the bottom of the plane, as well as this old school mapping camera, which you can see in this picture here to help interpret the radar imagery. And the mapping camera collected data in 3 spectral intervals: the near infrared, the NIR, the red part of the spectrum, and the green. And these data were looked at and worked up and cataloged and corrected and ultimately released for public consumption by Ethan as part of his master's thesis last year. He has a full write-up in this journal article appearing in Remote Sensing in 2019. So here's what, here are the actual color infrared camera data sets that Ethan has put together, as well as the URLs where you can freely download them if you would like to play around with some of these really neat, super high resolution camera imagery over this remote part of the Earth. The other key spatial data set that was collected as part of AirSWAT was the radar, interferometric radar data. The handling and processing of these data were led by Jessica Fain, my PhD student who's now wrapping up at UCLA. I'm not going to get into the details of this technology, but a total of 6 data sets are produced from the radar data, including the brightness of the backscatter return, some other parameters, which I don't have time to get into, but most, the truly novel measurement appears over here on the left-hand side of this 6-pack of data sets, which is the height. This is the topographic height of the water surface as derived from the AirSWAT radar. And here you can see the source for these data as well, if you'd like to download them and see a README file and a write-up on how to work with these data. You can get them from that website right there at Oak Ridge National Laboratory. Here's just a side-by-side comparison of the 2 technologies carried by AirSWAT. On the left, we see a classic color infrared camera image acquired in 2017 over some woods and wetlands and a sort of convoluted lake. And on the right, you see the Ka band radar image, which in kind of a grainy black and white tone. Looks kind of hard to interpret, not really sure what you're looking at on the right. It's certainly clearer on the left. And this speaks, of course, to the need to why we have to have the mapping camera on board the plane as well as the radar, because the camera imagery on the left really helps us to interpret the novel, exciting new radar data on the right. And what makes the radar data so exciting is that we can make these digital elevation products, such as the one you see on the right. These are elevations of trees and water surfaces. But again, it's hard to know what's water and what isn't water in the radar imagery alone. So this is why we use the camera data on the left, for example, to identify where the open water surfaces are. And then by using those paired images with the water map on the left, using that water map on the left to intersect with the elevation data from the radar on the right, this allows us to trim away the land and only use the radar elevation measurements within known open surface water bodies to average together and extract our water level information. So at the end of this process, we can create new maps like these, which show not only the extent of the water, but the level in the water with very precise knowledge, a meter or better, as we will see. Now, this hadn't ever been demonstrated before 2017, and it's exciting new technology. And part of the studies we've been doing is to assess whether how well this radar technology works or not. And that was one of the big things we did in 2017, or continuing to do, and have been doing ever since in 2018, 2019, with big summer campaigns sent up to this area. So the field measurements are very difficult to obtain, and these yellow circles show some of the places where we were able to get to on the Canadian Shield and northern Alaska by float planes and helicopters and so forth, and where we use very high quality GPS survey equipment to measure the water surface levels. I'll show you a picture of that in a moment. But of course, it's impossible to get to many, many places on the ground, all across the domain. So the other technology we deployed is a NASA LiDAR or laser that is also being deployed as part of the NASA Arctic-Boreal vulnerability experiment. And the acronym for this laser technology is called LVIS, LVIS. And so by design, we overlap the AirSWAT flight paths with the LVIS flight paths so that we could use this more established laser technology to compare and contrast with the radar elevations, as well as the ground-based in situ measurements from floating GPS rafts like the one you see here. So what I'm going to do in the next couple of slides is to, pardon my screen here, which is advancing. What I'm going to do with the next couple of slides is just show comparisons of the field GPS data acquired from rafts like this one, and the also comparisons between the LVIS Airborne LiDAR and the AirSWAT Airborne radar. So first off, the upper left-hand corner here shows a plot of the GPS-based field measurements of water surface elevation, or WSE, in totally independent measurements collected by the little raft. Those appear along the y-axis of the upper left-hand plot, and appearing along the x-axis are the water surface elevations that we derive from the AirSWAT radar. So simply plotting up these measurements for over 20 different lakes all across Northwest Canada and up into Alaska, reveals a good overall one-to-one correlation between the field measurements and the AirSWAT radar measurements, which is really encouraging, and we're very excited to see this. Diving a little deeper, you can see that the radar estimate of water level, which it corresponds to the sort of centroid of those histograms of elevation retrievals, are again quite close to the field GPS measurement, which is indicated by the black bar. But there is a little gap between the vertical black line and the vertical red line, and consistently with the radar consistently suggesting a somewhat lower elevation, on the order of 50, 60 centimeters than the black line. So there is a small systematic offset that we're trying to get to the bottom of understanding. But the overall good news is that just right out of the box, this AirSWAT radar is getting water surface elevations within a meter or so of a completely independent and much more difficult to acquire field measurement. Comparing the AirSWAT radar elevation, water surface elevation measurements with the LVIS water surface elevation measurements, which gives us many, many more points, because the LVIS LiDAR scans huge areas of the landscape, which we can't do with field measurements. But again, we see an encouraging correlation between these two data sets, and again, that same small but systematic offset of, in this case, of about 37 centimeters. But all in all, both the field measurements and the comparison with the airborne LiDAR suggests that we're getting water surface elevations with accuracies of well under 1 meter, just right out of the box. Scientifically, this is useful because we can map for the first time water elevation changes across huge areas of the north. And that's what we demonstrated with this flight campaign, by first flying AirSWAT in early June, and then early July, and then coming back and flying the whole line again in August. And what we see is an overall drawdown of around 20, 30 centimeters on average of all of the lakes and wetlands across this area. And this kind of measurement, makes sense to us. It's consistent with what we would expect given the seasonality of this environment, but it's a very powerful demonstration of the capability of this technology. Of course, one of the big reasons NASA has developed this airborne technology is not just to be an end unto itself, but to be a forerunner and prototype for global systems that will collect these types of measurements everywhere on Earth. Through 2 very exciting new satellite missions, one which was just launched last year called Icesat 2. This is a satellite laser system that measures the Earth topography, and also, as we're learning, gives good retrievals off of water surfaces as well. And my lab is working on this very problem right now, including also our current Voss postdoctoral scholar in IBIS, Dr. Johnny Ryan, is leading the way on this work, as well as Sarah Cooley, a recent graduate. She's just actually graduating this spring from Brown University. The other satellite technology that is directly relevant to the AirSWAT radar measurements is a forthcoming satellite mission called SWAT, Surface Water and Ocean Topography mission, which is being built right now by NASA and the French space, NASA in the US, the French Space Agency, CNES in France, as well as the Canadian Space Agency and a smaller role of the United Kingdom Space Agency. This exciting new radar technology will use Ka-band radar to map water surface elevations for all of the Earth's lakes and wetlands and rivers beginning in late 2021, or more likely early 2022. But we don't need to wait for SWAT to already capture some of these exciting dynamics. And I'm turning now to work by Sarah Cooley, most recent PhD student who's just graduating this spring from Brown University. She's on her way to a tenure track job at the University of Oregon, the Department of Geography there. And one of the really exciting pieces of work she did for her PhD was to use Planet CubeSat data. This is a private company that launches hundreds of these tiny satellites that really carry not much more than a camera and a locational beacon, GPS. And she used the images from these Planet CubeSat data to map out at very high resolution, in both high spatial resolution and high temporal resolution, map out water dynamics over these 4 areas of Canada and Alaska. And the real power of CubeSats is that because there's so many of them, it becomes possible to achieve both high spatial resolution and high temporal resolution, which is always, thus removing what has always been the biggest sort of limitation of satellite remote sensing, which is that you can't have both. You can't have both high spatial resolution and high temporal resolution. You want to have an image every day. Traditionally, you have to coarse in your spatial resolution to at least tens, if not hundreds of meters. If you want to have a high spatial resolution, you can do it, but the satellite will only return, once a month or something like that. So CubeSats have completely changed the game by getting around this by launching hundreds of these small satellites with cameras, taking these high spatial resolution images over small areas. Because there's so many of these things, you can stitch together the images to get information over very large spatial scales. And that's what Sarah did in this remarkable work, which was published last year in Geophysical Research Letters, tracking the seasonal inundation dynamics of the water bodies across those 4 areas throughout the course of a season. And you can literally see these lakes shrinking and growing in response to the seasonal climate. And the total area mapped using the CubeSats can be plotted over time, as shown on the right. And there's also some pretty sophisticated image processing and machine learning information technologies and algorithms that are used to do this. You can kind of get a sense of that from the flow chart across the top. I don't have time to get into that now, but in a sort of couple of sentences, the machine learning technique allows a ready way, if properly trained, allows a ready way to filter out these abundant CubeSat images, to sort of throw away the clouds and throw away the shadows and the noisy bad images and leave behind the higher quality ones. So the machine learning allows us to sort of absorb this fire hose of data and filter out the noisy data and keep the high quality data. So the scientific outcome of this was to track the changing inundation patterns over these remote landscapes. And this can be plotted in a couple of different ways. The sort of relative change in area, like on a percent basis, and the absolute change in area in sort of absolute square kilometers of inundation. And both ways are shown here. But what's interesting about the results is that we see, again, that overall seasonal drawdown in water content on the land, which is consistent with what AirSWAT showed in 2017. And for these 4 different areas, all of them experienced drawdowns, but some more dramatically than others. For example, on a percent basis, the Yukon Flats area in Alaska is very dynamic. That's the blue line here up at the top, sort of dramatically crashing in its inundation extent by late August, where the other areas, the Canadian Shield and the Mackenzie River Valley and Hudson Bay Lowland, they sort of experience inundation declines more gradually. That's on a relative basis. But if we look at the absolute landscape coverage, the story becomes very interesting because the Canadian Shield, which is this red line across the bottom here, leaps to becoming the most dramatically, not desiccated, but it experiences the most dramatic reductions in total inundation across the landscape throughout this summertime period. And even though they're on a percentage basis, it's rather small. You can see up here, the red line is it's not nearly as dramatic on a percentage basis. In absolute terms, because the Canadian Shield is so wet and covered with so many lakes, these small inundation changes, on the order of just a few percent, actually accumulate to huge areas of intermittently wetted land. And this becomes very important for calculations of methane flux because methane release from the ground is very active in these intermittently inundated parts of the landscape. So we're excited about this finding because it brings attention to the Canadian Shield, which is a landscape that has traditionally been thought to be, well, kind of boring, sort of stable and not changing very much. And that is true, but because in relative terms, but because the small changes that it does experience add up to such huge areas, it actually turns out to be somewhat of a big elephant in the room with regard to total landscape inundation variability. So just to wrap up the technologies and some of the first scientific findings that are coming out of this research, what I hope I've communicated in this Earth Day talk to you today is that there are exciting new opportunities right now for remote sensing of northern surface water, which are providing radically new types of measurements of water surface elevation and capturing very small water bodies in these remote landscapes. Second, NASA is really leading the way with much of this technology, including through airborne remote sensing technologies being deployed through the NASA Arctic-Boreal vulnerability experiment, above experiment. These include the AirSWAT aircraft, which I led, but as well as a host of others. There are a number of different airborne assets which are being flown, have been flown over the past few years and will continue to be in the coming few years over this environment. And what's very exciting is these data sets are now being posted, have already been posted online and are freely available to you right now. The third point is that ELVIS, this is the NASA Airborne LiDAR, also seems to be sensitive to water surface elevation, which allows a useful measurement in its own right, but most importantly, it validates the AirSWAT imagery. And the reason I say that's most important is because AirSWAT covers a much larger area of the ground than the LiDAR. Radars are wide swath mappers, they cover large parts of the ground, whereas LiDARs, lasers, tend to be profiling instruments, which can collect only very narrow little strips of data. So we are excited by this cross-validation between the two technologies. And finally, the last 2 points. The first is that our airborne measurements in 2017 reveal a broad-scale summer drawdown in water surface elevations all across this landscape. And that finding is supported and consistent with the machine learning based time series analysis of planet CubeSat images led by Sarah Cooley. And finally, the really exciting point is that these types of measurements will not just be focused on northern environments anymore. Icesat 2 is collecting LiDAR or laser measurements of water surface elevation right now, and our lab is in fact working with these data as I speak. We're working with these data as I speak. with some very exciting conclusions. And the forthcoming SWAT satellite mission in 2021 or 2022 will blanket the Earth in radar measurements of water level for all of the world's rivers and reservoirs and lakes and wetlands. So a very exciting time indeed for this type of remote sensing hydrological science. And since water resources are really one of the most critical dimensions of sustaining ecology and human use and a habitable planet, I think it's just absolutely wonderful that these technologies are coming online to help us to steward this most precious of natural resources. So thanks for your attention today. And if you would like to learn more about what my lab is doing, I invite you to check out our website at northernchange.brown.edu. Thanks a lot, everyone. Bye-bye.